Welcome, everyone, to our next installment of Tux. We're really excited to have our second Sanders speaker here, Leila. Just a couple of quick announcements before we get started with her talk. In 2 weeks, we have Jim Slota speaking as part of Tux as a member presentation, and that'll be back at the University of Toronto. Another exciting announcement, especially coming from me, is that Autodesk has just announced that we're moving to the Mars building. So we've been enjoying this space so much for our talks, we figured why not move here and live here permanently. So we're really excited about that. We're going to be closer to both University of Toronto and Ryerson and look forward to a future of collaborations. And with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Kai Trong from University of Toronto, who's going to give the introduction for Leila.
Great, thank you, Toby. So I had the option of either giving an embarrassing story to introduce our speaker or a typed up set of notes to use here. Both the organizers and the speaker have asked that I don't give an embarrassing story. So it's my pleasure to introduce Leila Takayama. Leila and I have been friends for well over a dozen years at least. She was originally born in Hawaii, and at some point she decided that it was time for her to start braving the cold, and she moved to mainland. She moved to California as a teen. She studied at UC Berkeley as an undergraduate student in the Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology and Cognitive Science program. And while she was there, she studied under James Landay, who is an academic grandchild of, great-grandchild of Ron Becker. So she has a connection to U of T through James and Ron. This makes her an academic great-grandchild of our department. She conducted her PhD in communication with Clifford Nass at Stanford. She also holds a PhD minor in psychology from Stanford and a master's degree in communication. During her graduate studies, she was a research assistant in the User Interface Research Group at Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC. After she left Stanford, she joined Nokia Research, and then shortly thereafter, she moved on to become a research scientist and area manager for human-robot interaction at Willow Garage. In 2013, she joined Google X, where her public title is Senior User Experience Researcher. She has a private, secret title with the company that no one seems to know anything about, and she's not going to tell anyone about it. In addition to her role at Google, she is a World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council member for the area of artificial intelligence and robotics. She is a recipient of the IEEE Robotics and Automation Society Early Career Award. And in 2012, she was named an MIT Technology Review TR35 winner, top 35 under the age of 35, and one of the 100 most creative people in business by Fast Company. So it's with great pleasure for me to ask you to please join me in welcoming today's Sanders Series invited lecturer, Dr. Leila Takayama. Thank you.
Thanks, Kai, and thank you for not telling the embarrassing stories, because you have a few of them for me. Thanks everybody here for taking the time to come out. I'm going to give you a little bit of a whirlwind tour of a bunch of the types of research that I've done, just in case some of it might be useful or relevant to the stuff that you're doing here. And I did get one question earlier, does this have something to do with Thomas Nagel? Yes, it does. He's the philosopher who's known for sort of pondering this question of what's it like to be a bat. And I wanted to ponder this other question of, what's it like to be a robot? Actually, when you spend a lot of time with robots, you end up building this empathy for them that goes pretty darn deep. And hopefully you get a sense for that in this presentation. After visiting with folks at Ryerson and Autodesk and U of T, I realized there's actually a lot of other material that's also relevant. So I do promise there will be some other bonus material that was not in the abstract, too. All right, so let's get started. For those of you who haven't heard of this place called Willow Garage, it was this tiny little startup in Menlo Park, California, where we were doing open source personal robotics. We built this robot called the PR2, Personal Robot 2. PR1 was built at Stanford. And it is a 32-degree of freedom mold manipulation platform. What that means in normal English is it's a robot that rolls around and grabs stuff. It is human-sized. That's about it. And it was a research platform built mostly for universities and researchers like you and me who are trying to figure out and push forward the state of the art in robotics, in particular robots that are supposed to sort of live and be and do stuff amongst us. Human beings are incredibly noisy systems to model, and we are a total pain in the butt for robots. Right, so we run in front of them, we make big messes, we move around the objects in the world after it's spent all this time meticulously mapping the world, and we just make life hard for them. And that's sort of tough luck. They have to learn to live with us because this is our human world. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time, actually a bunch of time in this talk, talking about a skunkworks project that we ended up doing on the side over one weekend that ended up turning out to be an entire new startup in the space of telepresence also. I kind of want to start with a little bit of theory because there are academic friends in the audience and a lot of folks working in UBComp in this area. So I actually spent a few years while I was at Stanford digging through Mark Weiser's library archives, which happened to be at the Stanford libraries, because everyone, when I asked them as an undergrad, like, what is UBComp? They would all give me different answers. And it was extremely frustrating to say, like, oh, it's just Internet of Things. Oh, it's just mobile phones. We already have UBComp. Oh, it's, it's just whatever. Like, nobody would give me the same answer. And so I went digging through a bunch of his notebooks. All of the stuff that was in his office, basically, when he passed away, they sort of bundled up and put in the library there. And really, I think, in terms of where it came from philosophically, it was this idea of embodied virtuality, right? So bringing the computers into our physical world instead of sucking us into the virtual world. So what does that mean? I guess the way that I think about it is that today we sort of tend to work with computers this way. And virtual reality sort of sucks all those objects into that simulated world, whereas at the flip side of virtual reality is embodied reality, where we have computation, and instead of sucking people into it, we make it pushed out into our world. And I think robots just happen to be one of these examples where you're running a server rack that's running around your office on wheels that is very much embodied, that is very much in our space. It's very much having to deal with us as opposed to us going into this virtual little space. And there you sort of start running into some really interesting problems, right? So most people would say, my laptop's just a tool. That phone in your pocket, that's just a tool, whatever. Rationally, we know it's a man-made object, whatever. But really, say that tool rings right now in this quiet auditorium. That thing actually suddenly starts to feel like it has a whole lot of agency and it's really pissing you off because it's not doing the thing that you want it to do. At the same time, when you're talking with your best friend on the phone, yeah, it's a phone, but really, when you're really in the heat of that conversation and you're really making a good connection talking with them, you should feel like it's not there at all. It should feel more like it's invisible in use. And UBComp was moving more towards that direction. How do we stop thinking about these computers as computers and start just doing our thing through them, right? They should enable us without having to be this thing that I stare at and think about rationally all the time. It just so happens that in robotics we have similar issues, right? So there's me controlling a robot. Maybe I've got my Wowie with a little remote control. Fine, that's a tool, that's a toy. And I can interact with it. It can be very agentic. And on this flip side, when people teleop robots, I mean, if you're, say, an astronaut operating the Canadarm, right, it should feel like you're just going out and doing work. It should not feel like I am manipulating a bunch of buttons and tools and widgets such that something happens way over there, right? It shouldn't feel that disconnected. It should feel like I am just doing this thing. All right, so let's do some examples of these. People always think about robots in terms of sci-fi, so I'm going to disabuse you of some of the myths around robotics and show you some real robots. But when we think of robots, we tend to think of stuff like this. Go fetch me a beer. Really, I would argue that robots are everywhere already, right? When you go to get cash in an ATM, when you're using your automatic braking system in your car, you're really just suggesting to your car that it may want to slow down soon, sometime. It's going through a computer. Same thing with your Nest thermostats. And of course, there's more robot-y projects and products out there that you can buy, window washing machines, robots that suck dirt. They're kind of already around. They're not things that we tend to call robots because they don't look like the things we see in sci-fi, but really, they're sensing, they're processing, they're making decisions, and they're acting on the world. Philosophically, Heidegger talked a lot about things being invisible in use. He called it being ready at hand as opposed to being present at hand. And that was hugely influential on Mark Weiser and his thinking about UBComp. Another interesting one, so James Gibson, who's most famous for talking about affordances, right? So the door affords pulling. Similarly, he started thinking about, towards his retirement, this idea of a tongue that extends in front of you. So if I'm driving a really fast sports car, my car has this tongue of possible spaces that it can incorporate. And it's pretty long, and it's very nimble. It can go around the road. If I'm driving an old jalopy, that tongue's a little shorter, not so responsive, right? And so the machine that I'm operating is actually changing what I feel like I can't do, and is changing my sense of, my own abilities, which is pretty interesting. And of course, Scott McCloud talks a lot about these just sort of everyday mundane objects that feel invisible in use, right? When you're eating, you're not actually thinking about manipulating the fork and knife, you're just eating. And that's how it should be. All right, so I'm going to spend a little while talking about these robot-y robots, very agentic ones, and I'm going to switch over to talking about ones that become a little more invisible in use. So I mentioned one thing that is an issue for robots is a lot of people watch sci-fi movies. Yes, they're really fun and great, and they set expectations way too high for what robots today can really do. And this sort of taps into interesting questions from psychology. So if I ask you, what is that character in the middle? Yeah, probably a bee. And now if I ask you, what's that character in the middle? It's still a bee, because you saw that first, right? You've got that confirmation bias. Similarly, if Kai had introduced me here and said, Leila, she's not that good of a speaker, really boring. You would have come into this talk, not paid much attention, thought it was really boring, and learned pretty much nothing. If on the other hand, you come in here and said, she's gonna be a great speaker, awesome lecturer, you're gonna love this stuff, it's super interesting, that actually changes the way that you engage in the talk, you pay more attention, you think it's more interesting, you learn more stuff. And you would think and hope that with robots, maybe the same could be true. If I tell you robots are super capable and really interactive and so amazing, which is what marketers do today when selling real robots that were or are on the market. They say things like, Aibo is your partner, and Pleo can change his mind and his mood just as you do. These are statements that describe supposedly things that these robotic products can do. And I would argue that they're kind of overpromising a little bit. And the research question then is that a good idea? Should we be overpromising so that people buy these things and try them out? And what are the repercussions? So, as a social scientist, we decided to run an experiment to see what happens. Half the people in the study were told, this robot has many people sensing and interactive capabilities. The other people were told, this robot does not have many people sensing interactive capabilities. It's just a framing effect, right? All we did was set their expectation with a few words, and then we let them have at it and play with the robots to see what would happen. We counterbalanced the study, half men, half women, all that good stuff. And we tried it with 2 different robots because we didn't want it to be too robot specific. And the first hypothesis was that if you tell them it's smart, people are going to believe you and think that the robot's pretty smart. That turns out to be true. If you set their expectations high, they think it's going to be better able to perceive people and better able to perceive touch. But what's more interesting is after interacting with that robot, after I set the expectations high and they've actually played with it for a while, then what? Psychology theories will tell you, if you believe confirmation bias and self-fulfilling prophecies are what's at play here, then maybe you're going to actually have a better experience with the robot that you thought was going to be smart. However, in business theory, they would say the opposite. They tell you when you're talking to your manager about setting your goals for the quarter, you should really under-promise and over-deliver, right? So start low, tell them it's not so good. And then you beat those expectations. It could go either way. So there's competing hypotheses here. So it turns out that the business folks are right. If you set expectations low, you say these robots not so good at doing these interactive things. They believe that the robot is more competent after interacting with it. And you will see a lot of qualitative data here that I think is suggestive for future work that I have not done. But let's check this out. So,
do you want this leaf? Leaf?
He doesn't understand leaf.
Oh, that's cool.
But he can perceive the
Does it
leaf.
understand leaf?
It doesn't.
What about tree? Cookie?
He doesn't understand tree or cookie or leaf, but because he happened to make that sound at just the right time, she starts to form this belief that maybe he understands language, maybe I should play with this a little bit more. Here's one that's a little more scary. So the first person in this video was told, this robot is very capable. Second person was told, not so much. So this is Aibo after Sony stopped producing it. He lets it fall off the table, its ear and its leg fell off. Because he thought it was very capable. This woman was actually told it's not so capable. She's actually putting her arm
Definitely want to see if it can fall off the table.
down below the table to catch it in case it falls. And it did.
Definitely.
But she caught it because she didn't have high expectations about this system's capabilities. So she actually helped it to not have its leg fall off like the other one. For us, this was terrible because both of these robots are no longer in production, so there's no one to fix it besides us. Thankfully, IVA was a very robustly built product, and we were able to fix it ourselves. So things to think about, when I'm talking about robot marketing, right? There's new products going out there even right now, and if we overpromise their capabilities, it has a pretty good chance of biting us in the butt later on. So maybe we shouldn't be doing that. And in terms of the way that we frame the design of these robots, I think it really helps to have, robot face work, right? Just as humans have face work, and we present ourselves to different audiences in different ways. If you're presenting yourself as a robot to an audience that just hasn't worked with these much before, set those expectations lower, right? Like, don't use full-on natural language sentences and speech if you can't actually process full-on natural language yourself. All right, so that's a little bit about expectations. Now, what about actually the ways that robots behave? So this is a robot, this is a PR2 prototype, and this is him trying to open a door. So he's got a LiDAR, scanning the world, thinking about opening the door, but can't see it yet. Yeah, oh, there's the door. Finds the handle, eventually. Motion plans its arm and its gripper over to the handle, slowly opens the door. So these tasks are really easy for you and me as a human, but they're actually extremely difficult problems in robotics. So that handle is shiny. Makes it a little bit hard for LiDAR to see today. It's doing a lot of object detection and matching against all these other things in its database. And that's all fine. These are hard technical problems, but as a person who's living in this office space with this robot, it can get really, really annoying. So my office was to this side of that robot, and the coffee machine was to that side of the robot. And so every morning I would run in front of the robot to go get my coffee. And every once in a while, the software engineers who are working on this thing would just be like, stop running in front of the robot, you're messing up the point cloud. Now we have to start all over again. And I told them, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to do it, but I can't tell when it's trying to open the door or not. It looks the same when it's off and just charging as when you're actually trying to do some work. It kind of just looks the same. So let's try and fix this problem. So what we did was actually turn to folks who know a lot more about this than any of us. And those are the animation character animators, right? So people who do this for a living, trying to make inanimate objects more readable to humans like you and me. And so we reached out to Doug Dooley, who is an animator at Pixar. And this is what our robots do today. They just sit there and stare. They ignore the people who come up to them. They still stare, and then eventually they open the door. That's okay, right? That is functional. But we wanted to know what would make that better. So what if he thought about opening the door and actually looked around, and noticed you, so I know it's not going to just whack me by accident, and then opens the door. Does that help? We ran the site to figure out. Here's the other thing that is cool about robots is they know their state. They know if they succeeded at opening a door or failed, right? And right now he opened the door, doesn't give a damn. But what if he did? What if when he opened the door, there's a little bit of happiness? Does that help? And of course, these are robots, so they actually fail more often than they succeed. And so say the door's locked or the handle was too hard for this particular gripper to handle. He fails and doesn't care. But what if he showed a little bit of a reaction to that? What if there's a little bit of shame? This is my favorite one. Right, so it's cute, it's entertaining, but of course the question that we wanted to ask was does it matter, right? Does it make any important differences? So we ran a study where we showed people different combinations of these videos and asked them to rate what they thought the robot was doing, first of all, and then how they perceived that robot. We did it across a bunch of domains, delivering drinks, ushering people in a direction, getting help being plugged in, and trying to open the door. We balanced across participants as usual, either showing forethought or not, and either showing the reaction or not. Pretty clean. So we figured, people are probably going to like this responsiveness, and they're probably going to like showing forethought. And that turned out to be true. The people feel like the robot's more approachable and more appealing if it shows these types of sort of somewhat emotional behaviors that are goal-oriented. But this is the cooler result. So if the robot actually succeeded in doing its task, it opened the door, or it failed at opening the door, people think it's more competent if it opens the door, of course, right? It does its functional task. And if you look at the effect sizes here, even if the robot fails, but he looks like he feels bad about it, he gets a bump in perceived competence here. So the lesson here for all those robots that will fail from time to time is at least look like you feel bad about it. When you fail. And when you succeed, maybe at least show a little bit of joy because you did a good job. And that makes a difference in how people perceive your own competence, right? Like maybe it's not a functional competence, but it might be something that's akin to an emotional kind of competence. So adding this kind of forethought and reaction can help with human-robot interaction. And a lot of people talk about robots just being expressive, like, oh, it's happy, oh, it's sad. And really, I think those emotions should be tied closely to the robot's goals as a way for showing people, like, why are you happy? Like, what are you happy about? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? All right, so there's a couple of studies just on the sort of more typical HRI track where we're looking at people interacting with robotic agents. I'm going to flip now to the other side that's more like UbiComp, where we're trying to make robots invisible in use. So you forget that the robot's there at all. You're just doing stuff in the world. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. Our friend Dallas at Willow Garage was based in Indiana. He didn't want to move to California. Our real estate is ridiculously expensive. And his family, he just wanted to raise there. So this is what he looked like to us. He was a voice in a box on a table, which is all right, except that in our electrical engineering team, when we had a debate or a disagreement, it would get rather heated. And everyone would be yelling at each other around the table, and Dallas would be yelling too, and if we didn't like what he was saying, we'd hang up on him. Because we didn't really want to hear what he had to say. And so one weekend, his friends put him on Skype on a laptop on a cart. And so maybe we'd feel a little bit worse about shutting him off or hanging up on him because we saw his face, right? And he could roll into meetings, and this was like a little bit better. We hung up on him a little bit less. But really, like, if we're having a stand-up meeting somewhere or like an impromptu meeting in the hallway, he would be left out of it. And sometimes, like, the thing wasn't charged, and so we'd get him there, and he'd just die. And that wasn't so great either. So one afternoon, Dallas and Kurt actually stole some body parts from the PR2 and had him come into work like this. So, Eitan didn't answer Dallas's email, so he rolls into his office and starts asking questions and won't leave the doorway until he gets his questions answered. So he can be much more assertive in that space. And it was so powerful for us that we actually built a whole bunch of more prototypes similar, to the first one, just to see if we were crazy or not, right? So we're a bunch of roboticists. We like robots. Of course, everyone's going to love robots. That's not true, right? So we wanted to test our hypothesis with people who are more normal, right, who don't love robots for the sake of being robots. And that became my job. Of course, I do want to say none of this is new, right? So Eric Paulus was doing this stuff more than 12 years ago at Berkeley. And many other labs, including in Toronto. Wayne Gretzky actually, the one in the bottom left is Wayne Gretzky's robot that was used for children in hospitals who could then go to school via telepresence robots. And this was really hard to do back then because the wireless networks weren't all that robust, or like the bandwidth availability just wasn't there, right? So you could use it for maybe like 10 minutes and that was about it. So you don't see long-term usage that way. I think the real game changer probably was mostly in the wireless networks that enabled this to be for real. And there are a bunch of startups now that are working in this space, partially because it's technically viable. And there are other design directions that you could take these, right? So Ishiguro works on these humanoid robots, and so your telepresence robot looks just like you. And that's fine if you're the one operating your own body. It gets a little bit weird when your grad students are operating your robot. And so he has worked on some other areas where, the telenoid is actually this baby that's anonymous, and so it could embody anyone. There's lots of directions you could take this, and roboticists do, because we can. But I think that this one's actually an interesting, at least first foray into that area. So a bit of vocab. When I say local, I'm referring to people who are local to the physical robot. And when I say remote pilot, I'm referring to the person who's operating that robot from, say, Indiana. So we wanted to know what would people actually do with these. So we needed to get them out into the real world. We put them at the beginning just in 3 companies because they're kind of a pain to maintain technically, and had them use them for long periods of time, not just a few days, but like weeks and months, and some of them more than a year. The pilots were located around the world, but their robotic bodies were located in California, so we could help maintain them. And here's what people did with them. They're not that surprising, right? They just do the things that we do when we talk to each other in the office. We exchange ideas, we ask questions, we show off, we give tours, the stuff that you probably did this morning. What's much more interesting to me is where they did these things. So, if I look at today's Cisco telepresence systems, they're usually used in a conference room, or maybe an office. But you don't typically see them in places like hallways and communal spaces, which is actually where the majority of these interactions were taking place. And so it kind of suggested to us that maybe it has something more to do with informal communication as opposed to formal communication. And really, Bonnie Nardi had a really nice framework for thinking about things that people were actually doing one layer beneath just what they talk about, but what are they really trying to achieve by being present. So I'll go through each one. Just showing up and putting your butt in that chair or putting yourself in that robot actually communicates to your team that you are committed to this interaction, that you're committed to this community, and you're willing to make the time and effort to be there. This is actually a director for Firefox who was beaming in from Toronto to Mountain View to be part of the products team's all-hands meeting. Also getting attention, right? So I mentioned blocking the doorway until you get that answer. This is super powerful. Being able to pounce on your advisor is amazing. And I do advise talking to your admins to get help to find out where your professors are. But if you can't do that, these robots are pretty good for doing that too. And the most important, that sounds very touchy-feely, but is actually the most critical, is building social connections. So getting to know each other as people, not as coworkers, not just as lab mates, but as human beings, right? So these guys are playing pool. Our robots don't have arms, so they can't play pool, but they can heckle the guys who are playing pool. And that actually made us get to know these people as humans, right? We got to know them as dads instead of just as our coworkers who we filed bugs against. So, those are some exploratory field studies. I'm going to show you a few controlled user studies that came from the hypotheses that we started generating in the field. And then we build from there. All right, so just these are available as commercial products now. The spin-out that I mentioned is called Suitable Technologies. And that was founded by the same guy who founded Willow Garage. The GUI, a few months, maybe a year ago, used to look like this. Now it is a lot nicer. And so basically, if I'm an operator, I'm running a native app on my computer, and I drag myself around. So this is what it would look like from the operator's point of view. And we often drive up to a mirror because people are not very self-aware about what you look like. You're kind of like Skype on a stick with wheels. But it feels a lot more powerful than that when you're actually interacting with these. You may have seen things like the double robotics thing. It's very similar, right? Things that matter a lot are the good audio connection that you get and being able to hear people in the room. That's very hard to do well. Having a reliable internet connection so that you don't drop dead in the middle of the hallway like ours used to, but don't anymore. And having a sense of presence, right? So you may have seen this before. Yes, this is our prototype. Yes, it was on The Big Bang Theory. Sheldon took it. We did not steal the idea from him. They literally used our prototypes on their stage. So yes, it is Shellbot. One thing that we were really interested in as social scientists was, okay, so y'all say that these things are good for building connections. Is that really true? In social psychology, we talk a lot about in-group and out-group behaviors, right? And can these telepresence robots actually increase how much of a team member you feel like? Do you become in-group because you're present in these systems? One way that can be done, and has been done by my advisor Cliff Nass before, was they would just put a blue armband on a person and then put a blue frame around a computer. And that tiny little manipulation would actually make people build affiliation with the computer. They'd be nicer to the computer. They'd give it better ratings and spend more time with it, right? So even though it's a machine, we're still using these social cues from the human world in order to figure out how to interact with them. So we thought, let's try it with the robots. Like, people put stickers on them anyway. We might as well try it and let them do that. So we let people decorate the robots, either red or blue, interacted with someone through the robot, and then measured their perceptions of that experience. So we expected that decorating the robots was going to increase their sense of in-groupiness. And also, we told them verbally that your performance on this task is going to be graded either interdependently, like very team-like, or independently, like just do your best. Like, we're only going to grade you as an individual person. Again, we expected interdependent scoring, usually in social psych, will increase in groupiness. And that is true. They not only disclose more information, personal information about themselves to each other when we made them interdependent on their task, but they also ascribed less animal-like emotions to people, which is something that we tend to do to outgroup members. They also like the pilot more. Not super surprising. This is the interesting part. So, a nice thing about social science is that in using the scientific method is you get a chance to prove yourself wrong. And this is one of those examples. We thought that when you decorate a robot, you would feel more connected to it, more in-groupiness with it. Turns out that the exact opposite happens in a statistically significant way. So when you decorate the robot, you cooperate with it less, and you don't really want to talk to the person afterwards. So what's going on there? I think what might be happening is, the original studies with the blue armband and the blue frame had said, you're feeling like an in-group member with the computer. And that is true in the media equation. But I think with robots, and telepresence robots in particular, I might be bonding with the robot, but not necessarily with the person inside of it, right? So I just decorated this robot. That is my robot. Who's this dude logging in to my robot and taking over? That's not so cool. So now our hypothesis is actually it backfired. So, it's not always true that robots are going to be quite the same as computers because things get a little more complicated when you've got other operators and people involved. We've done a bunch of other studies in this space too, in case you're interested. Everybody always asks questions like, yeah, but you said that you hung up on Dallas on the phone before, and did it actually help him to be more present by being in these robots? We do have some data that shows that yes, especially when you have a taller robot, you can be more persuasive in communications and arguments with people. Also, there are a lot of people who say like, oh, well, wouldn't it be cool if grandkids could visit grandma in the elderly care facility? And we're like, well, okay, let's look at that, but let's actually ask grandma. And so we brought in a bunch of older adults to the lab to try out operating the robot, try out being visited by the robot. And the coolest thing about that study was, again, they proved us wrong and said, no, yeah, I want to see the grandkids. Sure, fine. But what I really want to do is get out more. I want to be able to go to places that I can't physically go to anymore, either because it's too expensive or it'll just hurt my back to be on the plane for 10 hours. And so really what I want is probably robots in the concert hall, the sports stadium, the castle that I can't visit in Paris, right? So that I can visit places and maybe even go with the family, right? I want to heckle the players from the stands. I don't just want to watch it on TV. I want to feel like I'm there and be there with other people who I know and love. That was pretty interesting. So they flipped our use case on its head, literally. And now the last bit is the messy part. So there are some situations where people kind of go both ways, right? It's not just a tool, and it's not just invisible in use, but every once in a while, it completely goes in the other direction. This is where things get complicated and really interesting, I think. So we like to believe that we can use metaphors for design, right? It'd be nice if we could say, this just maps directly to here, and it's very clean. But we start seeing breakdowns there with the telepresence robot. So these are two guys who are actually pretty close buddies at Mozilla, and they work together all the time. And this guy, who's operating the robot, got a little bit pissy when his buddy started pushing buttons on the robot. He was saying things like, dude, stop looking at my skirt, right? So he's actually, he's not wearing a skirt, but he started feeling so present in that robot that when people got too close to him, it was feeling like a violation of his personal space. Whereas for the local guy who's sitting here next to the robot, he's like, it's a robot, whatever, it's got buttons, I can hit them. And so, you've got this mismatch of the way that people are experiencing this interaction, and it's actually causing interpersonal problems, quite a few interpersonal problems between people who are using these machines. We actually removed the volume buttons from the final product because we didn't like it when people kept poking you in the face to turn you up or down. So, this is part of a much longer field study that we did with more companies. And it takes a while to get over the novelty effects, sometimes even as long as 6 weeks. So we went a lot longer than I expected we'd have to. And people would start saying things to us like, who's there? Well, you better wake that thing up, right? Because someone would just leave it dead in the hallway. They're like, all right, well, I'm done with my meeting. I'm just going to drive off now and turn it off, which would be fine if you were just on Skype, right? Because you're just on some computer somewhere. But when you do that on a robot, you're actually leaving dead robot bodies all over the office. And then someone has to go around, usually me, and put away all the robots and put them on the chargers. And that's kind of rude to do to your coworkers who are putting up with these machines already. We'd often see people complaining about, stop poking at my buttons, right? And, in robotics, we have these big red buttons so that you can e-stop the machine when it's doing dangerous things. But if you show a big red button to consumers, the first thing they want to do is hit it. And that kills your power to the motors on the robot. And so we would see people getting very defensive about their buttons, literally their real buttons being pushed. That was unfortunate. In the previous literature in computer-supported cooperative work and collaborative work, we talked about these things as spaces, right? So like it's a window that I'm looking through. I'm going into this other world, and we can't actually touch each other, but we can see each other through this pane. And that metaphor worked fine when screens were static. But these screens are rolling around your office, so that one doesn't quite work here. Other people have said things like, well, these are like proxies. It's just like avatars. Thanks to James Cameron, now we can say avatar to normal people, and they know what we mean. And a lot of people have used that as a way for talking about these systems. But I actually think they might be more than just avatars if you're starting to feel like your personal space is actually being invaded. And so, we looked back again at the qualitative data from these field studies. And we did see sort of 3 broad categories of behaviors here that were interesting. One, this place should look familiar to you, Toby, was at a site where we actually saw very good proxemic behavior, right? So we had these folks who were, just tootling around the office, and if visitors came, they would give the visitors a tour, and we actually saw like proper proxemic behavior and like presentation of stuff, and people would give room to the robots or people operating the robots. And then, stuff like this would happen every once in a while, which is a little bit upsetting. And then another interesting one was they'd get closer via robot than they would in person. So yes, they're close friends. He is the best sysadmin for that entire team, so everyone loves him. And if he'd been there in person, I'm not so sure she would have hugged him in person, but in robot somehow it starts feeling okay because maybe there is a little bit of distance there that makes it all right. And other people would talk about these systems as like, oh, it's just media. It's just Skype on wheels. It's just, oh, I'm going to robot into the meeting, right? So they're creating new words for this. Or they just thought about it as video conferencing, which makes sense, right? Because that's the media that this is sort of augmenting or complementing, probably not replacing. And then there are folks who really wanted to just talk about it as a machine. They wanted to forget that there was a person in there, right? So this guy was just really pissed that this robot was running around. Actually, in this particular instance, that pilot was having trouble operating the robot. He didn't have very good situation awareness. And so he was slamming into walls and then slamming into desks and then slamming into another wall and laughing because he was embarrassed, very embarrassed. But his coworkers thought he was laughing because he was trying to like mess with them. And so his coworkers were like, that thing needs a mute button. Like he needs to stop because it's being really disruptive. And they didn't want to blame the person. They preferred to blame the robot as a machine, right? Because that's their coworker. Again, something that looks like it would be a normal interaction is just a one-on-one between a manager and an employee until you look down at their feet. And if I was talking to you, Toby, and we were just having a chat and I put my feet on your knees, that'd be a little bit awkward. And so for this employee here, this is a little weird that the feet are there, but the base affords footresting. Like it looks like an ottoman. So yeah, they put their feet on it. And so that kind of informs the redesign of the industrial design for this system. They would talk about this thing as an it, right? So a piece of furniture, maybe a machine. And ideally, what we really were aiming for was that people would just treat these people as human beings, right? Just act as if they were there. That would be the best, right? Ideally, and sometimes this did happen, we'd have conversations with folks, and they'd forget if we had that conversation in person or in robot. That's really the goal. Of course, we're not there yet in every single situation, but every once in a while, you'd see glimmers of that kind of future happening. The most interesting metaphor that I saw people using that was a surprise to me was that they would say, well, it's almost like a person, except it's like a person with disabilities, right? Because it can't open doors. It can't knock. Well, it kind of can. You can run the base into a door a bunch of times, and it's something like knocking. But people would actually get up and help the robot similarly to ways that they would help people with other kinds of physical disabilities. Similarly, it couldn't see very well, right? Its camera is not as high resolution as our eyeballs are. And so people would start drawing bigger on the whiteboards, or they would sort of like push the robot closer to the projector so that they could see what the speaker was projecting on the wall. Or they'd yell from across the room, which is super obnoxious for everyone else in the room, but it made it easier for the person in robot to hear. And finally, people would say, we used to call it dying in the hallway when you lost Wi-Fi, or you rudely turned it off. And so the pilots would say, I didn't mean to leave it there. Really, I just lost connection. And I wish I had a medical bracelet that would say, like, please help push me forward 6 inches so I get another Wi-Fi signal on my machine. I think what we sort of gleaned out of this messy set of data was that it's okay when the pilots, the operators, and the locals agree that we're going to treat this thing as if it's a person, right? And that means that the pilot has to take more responsibility for their actions, right? They shouldn't be driving around like it's a video game. And it also means that they have stronger expectations about their personal rights. Like, you probably shouldn't be poking it in the face to mute the guy's voice. Or it's okay if both the locals and the operators agree that we're going to treat this as a machine. That's fine, right? It's okay to push the buttons. Don't worry about it. The downside of that is that then pilots take a little less responsibility for their actions, right? They might run around trying to run over your toes just for the fun of it, because they can, because they're in robot. And we did see people going in either direction, and the real conflict happens when the locals and the operators disagree, right? When one thinks it's very human-like, the other one thinks it's very machine-like, or vice versa. And so I think getting to those shared metaphors is what matters. It's not so much that we have to have one metaphor and everyone just stick with it and this will be, the way that we go. But it does need to be something that is talked about a little bit and agreed upon between people who are both remote and local. Finally, I mentioned, that guy who was bouncing off the walls and laughing at himself. People forget how hard it is to learn how to drive cars. And similarly, it's even harder to learn how to operate robots. So these were driven more like forklifts than like automobiles. And so you're actually back-driven, and it's really awkward. And so we decided, we make autonomous robots that can navigate by themselves. Like, why don't we just help them out? And so we stuck a little Hokleo laser rangefinder on the base so that it could detect obstacles. And if you're about to hit an obstacle, it would stop you. It seemed like a good idea. Until we ran the user study. And here's that study. So, just kind of like self-driving cars, you detect obstacles in the world in 3D, you don't let people hit them, you sort of make this cost map of the world, and you say it's going to cost you a bunch more if you really want to run into that trash can. And we put them through, an office environment, because that's where we were using these. We had them have obstacles like chairs, tables, and trash cans, not humans. And we had them, practice the course as many times as they wanted before they did it for real as a test. In this study, we either gave them robotic assistance, meaning we would push back against them if they tried to run into things, or we would just let them do whatever the heck they wanted to do, like running into walls and desks and tables. The other thing that we measured was actually a construct that comes from personality psychology, which is locus of control. So if I have a very strong internal locus of control, it means that I am the master of my own fate. I do not believe in destiny. I believe that if I do well, it's because of me. If I fail, it's all my fault. And there are people who are on the other end of the spectrum, which are very external locus of control, sort of like, I just take life as it goes. I go with the flow. Things are just going to happen. It's going to be okay. If things go well, like maybe I got lucky, right? And those are totally reasonable attitudes to have. People do tend to fall somewhere along that spectrum. So we categorized them just to see if it mattered. We hypothesized that they would hit fewer things if we gave them assistance and would take less time to finish the course because we're helping them, right? It seems kind of obvious. And yes, they hit fewer things because we didn't let them. Of course, some of them managed to hit things even though we tried not to let them. This is more interesting, though. They took a lot longer to use the system to run the course when we gave them obstacle avoidance assistance. So the autonomy was somehow backfiring on us in terms of task performance. And we wanted to know why. One hypothesis was that if you have an internal locus of control, maybe you don't really like giving the robot the ability to tell you no, don't hit the trash can. And yes, for people who believe that they need to be in control of their destiny, they were taking longer to finish the course when they had autonomous assistance. But this is really, I think, the most telling bit here. So those 3 bars down low are not statistically significantly different, but that big one up there is. So if I believe that I should be in control, maybe I drive a manual stick shift automobile, I will fight that autonomous assistance, right? So I don't care that obstacle avoidance tells me not to hit that can. I want to hit that can. And so they end up fighting with it so much that it decreases their overall task performance on getting through the course. And so, what does that mean? I think basically it just means, kind of look out for the personality types of people who are operating these robots. And if they do need to be in control, either give them manual overrides, help them build more trust with the system, or maybe take it away if it's safe enough to do that in that domain. Another thing that I wanted to mention that was a separate project we were working on was sometimes humans just need to be in control. Yes, your autonomous system could help them, but that doesn't mean that it should. And so this is a picture of Henry Evans, who became paraplegic and mute, I think, oh gosh, more than 10 years ago now. And he's actually using an eye tracker in one finger to control the PR2. And I remember the day when we asked him, like, if you could do anything with a robot, what would it be? And he said, I want it to scratch my nose. I want to scratch my own nose, actually, because you don't really realize it when you can move your own hands, but we scratch our noses and our faces probably like 50 or more times per day. And when you can't do that yourself, it's infuriating. And having to ask someone else to scratch your nose feels really trivial, and it's kind of demoralizing. And so really, he just wanted to scratch his nose by himself. And yes, it looks here like a robot is scratching his nose, but actually, Henry is the one driving that robot. He's the one operating it to do it himself. And having that empowerment to do it yourself is what really mattered. It didn't really matter that it had this big honking robot next to him. It was just that he now had that capability back again. So I gave you a whirlwind tour of a whole bunch of different types of studies. People interacting with a bunch of interactive robots that feel more agentic than maybe they should. A bunch of examples of where people start feeling like they're able to do things through the robots without necessarily feeling like there is a robot there. And then all this messy stuff in between, which is actually where I think the more interesting research is to be had, right? So shared autonomy is a super hot space right now in robotics, and one where HCI and HRI have a lot actually to contribute. There's a lot more work that I could show you all here, so if you're interested in any of these directions, I'm happy to chat afterwards. I just want to make sure I mention too, in terms of thinking about where this work is all going. I think for me, the driver for all this work was Cliff's work, right, on the media equation. We know that people will treat computers as social actors and other kinds of media, and robots are mostly the same. Not always perfectly the same, but very close, right? These feel like characters. They feel lifelike, even though we know that they aren't actually alive. And that tends to be a good framing for these systems. And he always pushed really hard on like, okay, so if you've got this agent that you're interacting with, what is its role? Where does it fit in society? His training was in sociology, right? So, is it a co-pilot? Is it your boss? Is it your teammate really? Would it really give up its own goals for yours? And, we get a little bit fast and loose with our language when we talk about, oh yeah, my robot buddy in the manufacturing line is going to help me do stuff. Like, what does that really mean in terms of the interaction design for how people are going to work alongside these robots? Should we just make it a tool? Like, maybe that's fine too. These are really important for how people can and will or maybe won't accept these machines in their lives and in their work. And on the flip side, I don't know if you know this, but Bill Verplank actually was advised by Thomas Sheridan, who was also a very big deal in robotics, and he had this really interesting framework of like human supervisory control. So it's not that the robots are running amok and doing their own thing. They're running amok, but we're the ones sort of supervising them as managers. And what does that mean for us, right? So if you think about, and of course this is Bill's diagram, you're a human and you're lifting a load. And that's just sort of today's world. But what if the computer could extend your ability to lift that load? What if it could relieve you of some of the ability by taking on maybe the more tedious stuff? Maybe it's a backup, right? So usually we talk about robots as just replacing us. And I would argue that that's a way oversimplified way of framing robotics. Like usually, if you actually worked on any robots, there's like a dozen robot wranglers for any single robot that's out there in the world. It's not a question of whether or not there are humans around them. It's a matter of when and where and how. And I think if we could build in this space of reimagining the ways that we think about the ways that robots can extend the ways that we do things today. Because realistically, we don't have Rosie the robot right now. And in the meantime, that's okay, right? It doesn't mean that we have to have perfect AI tomorrow. But there's a lot of useful things that we could do along the way to there, given the current capabilities of AI and machine learning. I also want to mention, I totally did not do this work myself. These are some of my collaborators. who have been a total joy to work with. Many of them are co-authors on all the papers that I cited there. And we did this not just at Willow Garage, but with a whole bunch of other companies and organizations around the States. And a lot of people ask me this, so I'm just going to put this up there now. What happened to Willow Garage? Well, everybody dispersed to a bunch of really interesting places, and they're still doing really interesting work, and it still is a pretty thriving community. So, you know, the robot operating system is still open source, it is still out there, it is still maintained, and it's actually a growing community now that's used across a whole bunch of universities and now corporations increasingly. With that, I'll take questions. Thanks.
So yeah, we have time for questions. There should be a wireless microphone. If someone could just grab that,
I can repeat that questions too if we need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're recording the talks and the question and answer period, which is why we're going to use the microphone. So I'll grab the microphone. Just put up your hand if you'd like to ask Leila a question. We'll come by and pass it to you.
Rod? I can just repeat the question back if you need. Thanks.
This is sort of a complicated question. Consider three scenarios. I'm interested in events like birthday parties, Passover Seder's, weddings, events that seniors cannot get to.
Yeah.
Is there research that compares the experience from just setting up a camera somewhere in the event to having someone walk around with a camera?
Yeah.
To using one of these telerobots? That's question one. And then question two, let's imagine these, I mean, if you take the spectrum of events, include weddings, people are spending tens of thousands of dollars. What would it cost to ask the wedding company to deliver one of these telerobots to transmit?
Yeah, cool. So I don't know of any studies that would directly compare a static camera to someone carrying around a camera versus a telepresence robot, but I do know of many people who have been looking at similar settings. So Selma Sabanovich at Indiana University did this cool study where she was looking at older adults and how they felt about cameras just being in their spaces. And cameras in the ceiling were not cool because you tend to forget they're there. And they feel very invasive and sort of surveillance-like. Cameras on the robots were slightly more acceptable only because, you know, if I have this candy that I'm not supposed to be eating and I can see that the robot's over there, I can hold it over here and sort of like inch towards the table and not show it to the robot. And because it's physically in my space, I actually feel more reminded of it. And so the privacy, you saw some interesting privacy behaviors, privacy protecting behaviors there, but they actually felt more in control of the situation. I think in events, that is the best place to start using these technologies. I have seen a ton of people, I've had to sit at the wedding table where they have Skype on a laptop because the person like broke their ankle or something the night before. That's everywhere now, and actually a bunch of convention centers, places like CES, have been setting up their Wi-Fi so that they can handle these telepresence robots for people who want to attend these big events but can't make it there in person. So I think that use case makes a ton of sense. Yeah?
I wasn't as interested in the cameras being in the senior space as the cameras being in the event. So
right, at the birthday party.
You can't get to your granddaughter's wedding.
Yeah.
So, of course, there could be privacy issues there as well.
Yeah.
People being sensitive to being on camera, et cetera.
Right, right. But at least at least at weddings, there's usually the photographer with the big DSLR on your face anyway, so you're kind of on display whether you like it or not. So I think it might be a little more acceptable there. And people are sort of used to like us capturing the moment, right? And so having a live camera feed probably feels a little less invasive. We've definitely used them, or we did use them at Willow for events and parties. There's actually a really fun fundraiser that we had, and some of the folks just couldn't fly in on time for the party. And so they got to do the cocktail party in robot. And the most interesting thing to me there was that the people who were very extroverted and knew how to work a room in person, they just did it the same way as they did in person as in robot. Like they talked to every single person in the room, and they even exchanged business cards by like taking pictures in the camera. And they were cracking jokes like, "Hey, nice shoes," and the women would be like, "Why are you looking at my feet? Oh, where's your cameras?" And so it was super interesting just sociologically too. And the people who are more shy, who might like, just talk to a few people and stand in the back, like they did the same thing in the robot. They would just sort of like hang out and like watch from the corner and be like, oh yeah, there's this famous person over there, I don't want to talk to them. It was really like they expressed themselves the same way they did in person as in robots. So I think we're going to see more of that happening as these get cost reduced and more pervasive and easy to get your hands on. It's going to be interesting to see how larger society starts accepting these, right? Like these were tech companies still. They weren't just like a hospital or a football stadium, but we're starting to see them get out more. I think actually Suitable just put one in the White House. So Obama's interacted with one, which is interesting, security. But they managed to make it work, right? And so I think they're going to enable us to go to places that we wouldn't have otherwise gone, spend time with people that we couldn't have otherwise see. And in that way, they're more powerful maybe than things that are fully autonomous systems even. Yeah.
Karan Singh, University of Toronto. Great talk. I just had, it's sort of a two-part question. The first part was, are there any lessons from all the studies that you've done on the telepresence robots that transfer over to avatars in virtual reality? And
Yeah.
The second part of that question is avatars not in virtual reality but in augmented reality, perhaps as an alternative to telepresence robots altogether.
Totally. So Jeremy Bailenson was in our department at Stanford and is doing this work, and he's really big on studying psychology with VR, and a lot of the results that we were seeing, for example, when you have a taller telepresence robot and you're more persuasive, he's found the exact same results actually before us in VR, where if you have a taller avatar talking with a shorter avatar, you're also more persuasive in those situations. And so I do think a lot of them do transfer to VR, and the other way too. Same with augmented reality. I think the biggest difference probably between the virtual characters and avatars versus these is that when you're physically there, there's a different level of commitment and risk that you're putting yourself in, right? So Sarah Kiesler once joked to me that like people used to tell her, well, of course we build more trust when we're here in person because you could punch me in the face right now, but you're not, which is kind of an extreme example. But there is something different and very visceral and slightly threatening when you are there in person. And so there have been folks in the HRI community who've compared on-screen avatar versus in-person physical robot. And you tend to see heightened effects with the robots as opposed to the avatars. But I do think you could do a lot of prototyping in VR and AR, and maybe that's enough for a lot of these applications.
So you said like telepresence robots, they're usually on wheels, but what about now since drones are so popular, like how about that? Now you can get height and they can have more versatile movements within the area.
Yeah, interesting you asked that. So right now, in my current job, I work on Project Wing, which is the small UAVs flying around end users, which is super interesting. I think things that are flying are very dynamically stable, right? Hopefully they are stable. And people are not really used to planes being that close to their heads, especially with spinning rotors. And so with the flying things, I often see more of like, oh geez, like do they run or do they not, is the behavioral metric, as opposed to like how do they perform on the task. So we're not quite there yet, but we might get there soon. To me the biggest difference is like how safe do you feel first, and then what is the interaction like. I have seen other form factor. So actually Eric Paulos' very first version of that prop, the personal roving presence, was a blimp with a creepy eyeball on it. And then he did one where he actually projected your face on the blimp. And he was telling me that actually the biggest problem they had with it was they took it to Ars Electronica to do this like awesome demo. And then someone turned on the air conditioner and it got sucked into the HVAC. And so like the face was like up in the vent. And so, you kind of forget about those kinds of things when you're designing these systems in a lab, which is why I think getting them out there makes a really big difference. That's when he switched to the ground-based robots. But I do think there's a lot more exploration to be done, right? Because like if you're flying, now you can go into spaces that you couldn't if you were on wheels, right? Like I can't do stairs with my rolling avatar, but I could just fly up, right? Because that's no problem. You're in open space. So I think there's a much bigger design space than just the Skype on wheels. That would be super interesting.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
We have maybe time for one more question.
And I'm happy to stay after, too, to chat more with folks.
Hi. So if the goal is to have these robots be like a natural, casual part of our lives,
Yeah.
Or in some situations, those people who can't get over the fact that they're machines and
Yeah.
treat them like such, would
Yeah.
making their physical representation more human-like, how does that affect that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever measured like their willingness to treat it as a human before, but it would be that would be an interesting variable to throw into the mix, even cross-culturally, right? So like Ishiguro makes those humanoids that look just like him, and Westerners have very different reactions to it than folks who are from Japan, for example, right? So I do think there are some really important individual differences other than just locus of control for us to take a look at. I've noticed, at least with people who are very charismatic who are operating these robots, like some folks at some of our field sites, they're able to get so in your face and so interactive and personal that they can sort of make it easier to forget that you're being mediated in some way. Whereas people who are a lot more shy and like don't really want to talk too much, like it makes it easier to remember that like, oh, it's just they're just in a machine, they're not really here. So a lot of it depends on the way that you introduce the technology and who it is that you're interacting with through it, because some folks just use it differently than others. So like one thing that we've discovered was it's actually best to introduce the telepresence systems through a peer, like someone, like everyone's favorite sysadmin, right? As opposed to, oh, it's the co-founder of this huge company. Right, because then the intimidation factor is gone, the friendliness, like you already have rapport with that person, and so you can sort of ignore that they're in a mediated situation a little bit easier. But it's a really interesting question. That'd be an interesting design direction to go in, yeah.
Great. All right. Well, everyone, let's please thank Leila one more time for the great talk and the question and answer period. And we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Right? Thank you.